A budget is telling where your money needs to go, instead of wondering where it went. Is the government spending your money wisely? Good evening and welcome. This is Face the Nation. Our topic of discussion today is Budget 2016 and the way forward. My guests are this evening Mr. Anushka Vijayasinghe, Chief Economist of the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce, Mr. Lakshman Sirivardhana, Executive Director of the Pathfinder Foundation, Professor Sirimal Abhiratna, who is an economist, and also Mr. W. Vijayawardena, former Deputy Governor of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka. He joined us 2 weeks ago as well. Starting off with Mr. Vijayawardena, each speaker would get 2 minutes each, and thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining us this evening. Starting off with Mr. Vijayawardena, a lot of confusions in terms of Budget 2016. What do you gather from the presentation that was made by the Finance Minister, Ravi Karunayaka, in Parliament today? Yeah. The time starts now.
Yeah, Samir, in fact, given the current crisis in the fiscal sector in the country, I think we have to congratulate Minister Ravi Karunayaka for presenting a budget in Parliament. Because he has done a job which normally an ordinary person couldn't have done. However, the type of expenditure programs that he announced in the budget, there was no any indication how he was going to raise revenue. Because the Prime Minister 2 weeks ago, when he presented the economic policy statement, he very clearly said that this nation was living beyond its earnings. Meaning that the government budget was actually spending money without a revenue base. And 2 days ago, Minister Amunugama also in a press conference said that the current revenue base is not sufficient for the government to meet its public debt service commitments falling on this year as well as next year. So given this factor, having announced so many expenditure programs, one would wonder how the government is going to raise revenue to meet these particular expenditure program. So this is a question that we have to ask, because details are not disclosed in the budget that was presented in Parliament today, and even I don't think even the members of Parliament were privy to that information. So what we have to do is we have to see how the revenue is raised, because without raising the revenue, the government of Sri Lanka cannot spend money. At present, there is a huge budget deficit. All the budget targets which had been announced for this year had been missed now. The income target, the revenue target, the deficit target, the revenue account surplus target. So what I mean is, therefore we have to look for more information to find out how the budget is going to be financed.
Mr. Vijayawardena, usually when you take a look at a budget after a presentation is made, we saw that during the last 10 years, people were aware of what exactly the budget was and the direction in which the budget was heading to.
Those details were not announced by the Minister in Parliament. Because if you looked at the budget, about 45 minutes is spent on talking about the history. Starting from
Mr.
the date of the independence, how the economic policies were framed and so forth. Then another 45 minutes about the ills that had been done to this country by the previous regime. The balance part actually got dragged on.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vijayawardena, for your thoughts and your comments on the first round. Let's now move on to Professor Sirimal Abhiratna, who is an economist. Mr. Abhiratna, UNP-led coalition government announced a budget today. Is it somewhat inclined towards the IMF? We saw the subsidy on fertilizer being lifted again this time. We saw in 2002 the UNP-led government had a fertilizer subsidy that went up to around 1,100 rupees. This was increased. How this time around it only applies to small-scale farmers. What is the thinking of the UNP government when they introduced this budget in question, Budget 2016?
I don't think that those measures that have been taken in the budget, they have any major impact on the economy. These are actually, as a tradition, we have been continuing with all these things and raising a little bit here and there, putting it here and there. and then continuing with that. But actually the real problem in the budget is not about the subsidies. Our entire tax revenue today, it is insufficient. It is not sufficient to pay the debt service. Annual debt, and it's in the capital and interest both when we take these things together. The entire tax revenue is not enough according to last year, and this year we are still, we have to know exact figures. But in a situation like that, how do we continue with a short-term budget without a long-term or medium-term program? And that is the major issue that has been there. And the government finance, it has very fundamental problems, and on both revenue side and expenditure side.
Professor Abhiratna, we've seen, you just mentioned as well that collecting tax revenue is important. However, we saw in the budget this time around, the pay tax being only applied for those who earn more than 2 million a year. So again, the government is taking measures not to collect taxes or somewhat please the public.
No, our tax revenue, yes, our tax revenue, it has a problem actually. The problem is that the large part of the taxes are collected through indirect taxes, that is taxes levied on commodities and services. And if you look at a country like this and that kind of per capita income levels and middle income country, and it has to be the other way around, and we should be collecting taxes from direct taxes like corporate taxes and income taxes. The second issue is actually those who pay taxes pay very high taxes, and those who don't pay, that's the majority, they don't pay taxes at all.
Supergate taxes were also removed, are you aware, Professor Abhiratna?
Yes, I think that's because last budget was much worse than the previous one.
Again.
And there has been some improvements this time. But I don't think those improvements are big enough or strong enough to make a big change.
Thank you very much, Professor Abhiratna, who is an economist as well. I now move on to Mr. Lakshman Sirivardhana, Executive Director of the Pathfinder Foundation. Good evening, Mr. Sirivardhana. Nice to have you on the show. Budget 2016. What were your expectations in terms of this budget? You had a government coming into play on the 17th of August this year. There was change on the 8th of January. What were your expectations? As a layman, let's talk about your expectations.
What I was expecting is that looking at the nature of the government, because please remember that my first degree is in political science, then economics.
That's why I said as a layman.
You know, looking at the composition of the government, which had various names called national government or something like that, and a unity government, but basically very diverse coalition government. I didn't expect any miracles to happen. While I know that the current Prime Minister believes very much in economic reforms, what he has mentioned in the mid-term program, his economic policy statement, is that third generation reforms have to be introduced. Knowing that, I was wondering whether he will be able to make much of a headway because of the nature of the government. There are 2-3 power centers and everyone is dragging. Even when the budget is presented, let's see how it is going to be implemented. There will be a lot of different views expressed within the next couple of days. You will see that. But other than that, I would have expected the same, just like what Mr. Vijayawardena and Professor Sirimala Abhiratna said. We are in a very grave, almost a crisis situation. It's not nothing to hide. It's not anything. That crisis is actually really real. It came into real. It blossomed with the what you call the 100-day program, 100-day package or whatever it is.
Mr. I want to interrupt you for a second here. You said that the government is in a crisis and was in agreement with Mr. Vijayawardena, who is the former Deputy Governor of the Central Bank as well. My question to you now is, Mr. Sirivardhana, wasn't the government aware that they will be in a crisis? Were they waiting until taking a reactive approach rather than a proactive approach?
This is the agony of so-called democratic politics. Because remember that 100-day program was just first you win the presidential election, then you have a problem of implementing what you promised. Promises are given to win the elections, not to run the country in most efficient and effective manner. Then you come, then within next 3 months you are going to have another election. Therefore, whatever that you promised, which are very, I think, most wasteful things that any government in this country has ever done, 25,000, 20,000 salary increases, pension increases. Oh my God, this is what you have seen. When you have created that kind of a situation, the government knows that this is the situation. They were buying time, and this budget is fair indication of certain reforms that are here to come, and what is not said, as Mr. Vijay said, is more important than what is said in this budget.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lakshman Sirivardhana, Executive Director of the Pathfinder Foundation. I now move on to Mr. Anushka Vijayasinghe, Chief Economist of the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce. Anushka, the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce represents the majority of the private sector organizations in the country. Do you think that the budget works or plays to the private sector this time around? The time starts now.
The short answer is yes. Speaking first, I think from an economist point of view, I think I echo some of the sentiments by the others that Sri Lanka really does have a fiscal problem, and fiscal consolidation needs to happen, both in terms of the split between direct and indirect tax, both in terms of how much we are again living beyond our means. Maybe we can get into that later on. I have some of the numbers that were actually part of today's budget. But your question specifically on the private sector, I feel that this is quite a good budget in terms of the private sector, because it hit all the right notes. And not just in terms of the big ticket items, but through and through we saw indications that there is more market orientation or more role for the private sector. So whether it was in a proposal to have some private sector management of export processing zones, or moving towards some private sector participation in education with a 10% of seats allocated free to Sri Lankan students who go through A-levels. Proposals like taking off the lease tax on foreign land ownership, which was a very controversial issue, again pro-investment, pro-business, making the commitment that investment approvals will be given within 50 days. So in that sense, a lot of the right notes were hit. But again, we haven't seen the details, so it's hard to really see how these are going to be implemented. We'll need a little time to digest, but the overall sense is that it hit a lot of right notes in terms of orientation towards the private sector and being towards a more modern economic system.
My next question to you is, Anushka, right notes were hit. Is it a practical budget?
I mean, budgets are only as practical as your implementation, and consistently, both in terms of budget allocations versus disbursements, Sri Lanka has disappointed.
A bag
and
of
also
goodies
in terms
to the private sector? Is that what you're trying to say, Anushka?
I don't think private sector was wanting goodies. Very clearly, even the Chamber's representations and the broader private sector to the Ministry of Finance and so on had been even to the extent of saying, we don't even want taxes lowered, we don't even want tax incentives, just get rational and just give us consistency. And I think that needs to be maintained.
Thank you very much, Anushka Vijayasinghe, Chief Economist of the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce. I now open the floor for questions from our journalists. Good evening, Nadine. Nice to have you on the show. Sonali on to my immediate left. Nice to have you on the show as well. And then Faraj Shaukat Ali, after being 2 weeks under the weather, and we have you on the show today as well, Faraj. Nice to have you on board today on the show without the file today. Nice to see you without the file. And,
no file, but it's all in this technological model.
Technology, indeed. Let's start off with Faraj. Faraj.
I think this question is for Mr. Vijay Wardner. Evening there. This budget says that the Minister of Finance hopes to have a total tax figure of about 18% of GDP. Is that ambitious?
Actually, his target is to raise the tax GDP ratio to 15% by year 2018.
Right.
Yeah, not to 18%. 18% is totally impossible. given the fact that we can raise only 12% of GDP today by your taxation, he's going to raise it to, according to what he announced in Parliament, to 15% by 2018.
And is that also overly ambitious, or?
Maybe, I mean, you have 3 years time, you can plan it properly, provided you will have a wider tax net, because currently the tax net is very narrow. So given all these qualifications, I don't think it is impossible for him to do.
Oh, I see. And how will this? A couple of weeks ago, you reminded us that the Prime Minister is saying that we need to tighten our belts and live within our means. How are they going to accomplish this? All these very ambitious projects that they've got in the pipeline, like the megapolis and so on.
That's the thing. I mean, we don't know as yet how the revenue for the expenditure program is raised. That we don't know. When Prime Minister said that we were living beyond our earnings, what he actually meant was that he was referring to the public sector, not the private sector. In the private sector, if we earn 100 rupees, we still save about, we consume about only 82 rupees, and we save about 18 rupees in the case of private sector. The particular allegation is made against the public sector, where if it earns say 100 rupees, it spends about 105 rupees. So the tightening of the belt should come from the public sector rather than the private sector. So that is where the government has to rationalize the expenditure programs, cut down the expenditure, and then at the same time raise the revenue base. So these are the factors that we have to take into account, and as Mr. Anushka Vijayasinghe mentioned, though the budget is private sector friendly, unless the budget is able to raise the revenue to generate the expenditure program, nobody can expect the targets of the budget.
Isn't there a danger that when the private sector is taxed so much? For example, I've just noticed that the casino tax, the annual tax on casinos has gone up from 100 million to 400 million. Then previously they had a one-off tax of ₹1 billion per casino. Isn't there a danger that some of these private sector people will leave the dinner party because they're taxed so much?
Yeah, but of course, one thing we have to keep in mind is that we cannot have a free lunch. Unless the nation is prepared to pay more taxes, the nation cannot have this expenditure program. So it means that we have to pay more taxes, and nobody can complain about it. We can't have the public expenditure programs plus the lower taxes also. So,
Professor Sirimal Aberatna, I'd like to pose this question to you. Now, the word crisis was thrown around quite a bit during the first few minutes of the show. Would I be correct in saying that this is an inherited crisis?
You mean in the budget?
Is the crisis that we are purportedly facing one that we have inherited?
I think that is largely the mistakes that we have done in the past, because we have got used to this very ad hoc taxation system on the one hand, and also unbearable or unsustainable expenditure system on the other hand. So because of these two things, I think we have caught up in this crisis situation. And crisis situation is actually, if you take the debt burden of the country, and actually if you take it as a percentage of tax revenue, because we have to pay the debt from tax revenue, and there is no other way to pay it. And if you take it, the total outstanding debt as a percentage of taxes, it is over 700%, which is actually equivalent to the debt burden of Greece. So we both are in the same situation, but of course still we are not in we have not fallen to that level, that because Greece has always had few problems of paying those things, and they could not pay few installments previously to European Central Bank and then to IMF and then some others. But Sri Lanka didn't do that. Why? Because we have been borrowing to pay our debts. So which means actually if our tax revenue is equivalent to our debt now, and all these expenditure things that we are talking about in the budget which is presented today, literally they should come from borrowings.
You're a university professor, so theoretically speaking, what measures do you take to resolve such a crisis?
I think we have few things to do, and I would say 3 or 4 key things. The key word here is the reform. How many times we have done reforms in the past? 77, major reform program. In 89, major reform program. And after 89, now so many years gone, and up to now there have been no major reform process. So it has to be, the key word has to be the reform, and I haven't seen that keyword anywhere in any policy document. That is my worry actually. And in the medium-term economic policy statement of the Prime Minister, I have seen certain key issues highlighted, and those are actually the things that we have been talking about for years, and we have been coming to this kind of crisis situation. So at least, and the government has identified these things. So the government has to undertake a major, bold reform process and purposive reform process. What are the areas, where are the areas, what are the areas that we have to address these reforms? And then one is the business confidence, okay, and that's a major area. We have lost the business confidence gradually over the years. And second thing is, of course, the government finance, and the one that we are talking about today. Another thing is actually our external finance. Another thing is the government has taken some steps in right direction, that is the public sector enterprises. So these are the key areas that we need to undertake reforms. And then the budget, annual, and it is not long enough to have all these reforms, but it should be consistent with this reform process. And that is another thing that I don't see a good consistency between the two things.
Anusha, I'd like to ask you this question. Being from the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce, the sort of umbrella representative of the business community in Sri Lanka, something that I witnessed about today's budget speech in Parliament by the Finance Minister is that he didn't really outline the revenue streams of the government, how they're expecting to generate revenue. There was talk before the budget, the Finance Minister had said they're hoping to raise 2,000 billion in taxes. Given the sort of lack of clarity in terms of revenue generation, being from the representative of the business community, does this worry you?
Well, it's natural that at the end of the ceremonial speech part of the Finance Minister's budget statement, that there is going to be less clarity, which is why in the next coming days there are at least 10 forums organized by both private sector and Inland Revenue Department to bring clarity on this. So for instance, just this evening the Inland Revenue Department is having a seminar. Tomorrow morning and on Monday there are several seminars, and there in fact every year the officials come and tell you this is how these proposals would work. So I think we need a bit of a reality check that it's just over an hour and a half since the budget speech ended. So I think we need to be a little patient in understanding what those sources are. But what I will say is that if I just look at some of the numbers that have been released in the budget, there is an increase in revenue that's projected of about 300 billion. There at least in the statement there is a commitment to reducing the budget deficit. In fact, earlier it was estimated at between 6.8 to 6.9% and now to 6%. Now that's ambitious and it's quite a divergence from what was earlier mentioned, but that's good because fiscal consolidation is needed. Also what's interesting to answer your question, where is the money going to come from? If these numbers that we have are correct, there's actually less money that's going to come from income tax and more money coming from taxes on goods and services and taxes on external trade. So I think we need to dig a little deeper once information becomes clearer in how it sits against some statements made by, let's say, the Prime Minister and even the Finance Minister today about shifting this mix of direct to indirect. reducing the indirect burden, because that affects everybody equally and it's not progressive, or rather it's regressive, and focusing more on direct tax. But here we're seeing that income tax projections at least come down. And the second and final interesting thing is that unlike many other budgets, we're seeing a huge projection in non-tax revenue. Actually, non-tax revenue is estimated to grow from 126 billion to 378 billion, so 200% up. And that's non-tax revenue. I think it's the first time we're seeing such ambitious targets on non-tax revenue, and maybe it's going to come from some of the listing of, I mean, there was one mention, we don't know again how it will work, it's early days, but the listing of non-strategic investments of a certain set of state enterprises, and that was mentioned today in the budget speech, listing them in the stock exchange. So maybe it will come from that, but I just found it interesting and I wanted to kind of point it out here, because some of that revenue seems to be being billed on coming from non-tax revenue.
Anish, I'd also like to ask you, with regard to small and medium enterprises, there were several proposals that were made, including the establishment of a SME regulatory authority, and also the mini industrial parks in Monaragala, Jaffna, Vaunia, etc., and Ampara. Do you see these as real incentives for the small and medium enterprises? Absolutely,
and this is a sector that I have focused a lot of my research on over the last 5-6 years, and we always seem to pay lip service, and successive governments, and maybe we are yet to see it happen with this government, but lip service to SMEs. But the fact remains that we need to get serious about SMEs, because if you look at the latest numbers from the economic census, over 95% of our businesses are either micro, small or medium. And that's a large part of our private sector. So when you're talking really about the Sri Lankan private sector, you're not even talking about the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce, because we are only one part of that. The private sector is really these SMEs. So some very interesting proposals, like you said, one was the proposed incubation, incubators in these mini industrial parks. Very good for business startups, very good to have an ecosystem of entrepreneurs, not just the kind of tech startups we see in Colombo, but going beyond. Also, there was mention of this, it's not so much a regulatory authority, but a new body to promote SME development. In the past, this SME agenda has always been split, very fragmented between different ministries, different agencies, and for a very long time many of us have been saying, streamline it and have higher impact, and hopefully that will come in through this. And interestingly, we are seeing it go even beyond that in this budget, because there were mention of a venture capital fund of funds, like a VC fund of funds, inviting the private sector to come on board, potentially a credit guarantee fund for SMEs, which again helps with the access to finance problem. A lot of very interesting things, and a large chunk focused on the microfinance, the MSME sector, and different because most other times it just focuses on a new concessionary loan scheme. But this time it seemed to be going beyond that.
Mr. Sirivardhana, I want to pose a question to you. We saw the present UNP government, when they were in the opposition, criticizing the construction of the Matala International Airport. However, this budget also gives somewhat direction, stating that three internal airports will be built, that is in Badulla, Digana and also Putlam. Internal airports will be built. Will these three airports will also be transformed into paddy storage facilities in the future? Would that happen?
I don't think that very easily we won't see that kind of stupidity from any other government or any other minister.
But that's the budget 2016 that outlines it.
No, what I mean, stupidity in the sense of making using a place like a paddy store. I mean, in this government it was done, and somebody else was very critical of that. It's just to, show the anger, viciousness of yours. Politicians are like that. But what is important is that there is a need for domestic airports if you want to popularize the domestic tourism. International travelers even going to other parts of the country, less developed parts of the country, it may help. But when you mention this kind of thing and what is going to be done without any time frame, therefore I don't think we should waste our time discussing that kind of proposal. It's like 45 industrial estates to be established. You know, you can have few acres of land cleared and have few little facilities and say that this is an industrial estate for SMEs. This is the history of what I have seen during 1990s and even some other during my career in the public service. What is important is whether they are going to remove the constraints that are there for establishment and continuation of private enterprises. Doing business index refers to that kind of, that part is not there in this.
Mr. Sirimal, are you also worried, like Professor Sirimal Aberatna, with regard to reforms being brought forward by the present regime?
No, the little what I heard up to now, not little, somewhat, there are certain very specific reforms. Now, for example, like in the RP, regional plantation companies, they are going to be given lease for, not like current short-term lease, but it's going to be for 50 years, and they are going to allow the diversification of crops. These are kind of reforms. As Anushka was mentioned, there are certain things which encourage private sector or give more space to the private sector. But unfortunately, due to the government, coalition government nature, probably to the extent that we have to come out with, now for example, privatization is what is in the budget in one form or the other, and that is how the non-tax revenue comes. And he was trying to say listing in the stock market is nothing but privatization, whether which portion initially is a thing to be decided later. And same with private sector management being introduced to the export processing zones is a very good step. I think it is privatization. We got to do that. We can't say we are not politicians, no. Therefore, better not. We don't need to hide behind anything. We need this kind of reforms, and some of these reforms are very clearly indicated in this budget. But of course, not to the extent that overall framework is reform oriented. And with regard to non-tax revenue or income that comes from foreign income, by tomorrow you will see that foreign funding that comes to the budget. I'm just wondering whether why nobody wants to mention about the IMF and the World Bank. Fund and the bank has always been, particularly with this kind of a budget, this kind of government, has been very helpful. I'm pretty sure that balance of payment support, the budgetary support from the World Bank are likely scenarios. But though for political reasons somebody may not be wanting to publicly announce it at the budget or something like that.
Mr. Vijayardhana, we have an election coming up in less than 3 to 4 months from now. Do you think that the budget 2016, whatever you heard, is targeted at an election?
Well, of course, some of the expenditure programs announced in the budget are actually directed towards the election, because the reduction of the prices of some of the food items, milk, food, canned fish and so forth. And at the same time, the government has to take action to consolidate the budget and get out of the crisis that we are in the fiscal sector by going for a medium-term budgetary reform program. So so one part of the budget very clearly indicates that it has been prepared with the election in mind.
Election in mind, will it be practical to implement? We have 12 months to see whether all these proposals that was brought forward by Finance Minister Ravi Karunanayake will be implemented, whether it's going to be a yes or a no. We're going for a short commercial break. Our topic of discussion today is Budget 2016 and the way forward. Stay connected, stay with Face the Nation. Welcome back to Face the Nation. We have with us this evening four guests who are talking about the government's 2016 budget. Let's start off with the third round with Professor Sirimal Aberatna, an economist. Professor Aberatna, a few years ago, exactly to be very precise, 2 years ago, right after the budget announcement was made by President Mahinda Rajapaksa in his capacity as a finance minister, you said the government does not have a vision and this worries you. And now again you're saying it worries you because there are no reforms. What's happening?
Some indications in the budget as well as in the medium-term policy statement. Nevertheless, overall policy vision, I haven't seen actually, still I haven't seen that one. Because we should have a vision, what is going to be after 10 years, after 20 years, and how Sri Lanka can sustain 8%, 10% growth rate over the next 10, 20 or 25 years or so. And that vision is still missing, and we have seen that the last 12 months or so, after we had all these elections, and these months also I think a kind of waste. We have been wasting time and delaying the reform process as well. The major problem, actually that's the heart of the problem, all the problems that we are talking about here. Sri Lanka needs to raise our investment to around 35% of GDP and even maybe possible even more than that. So there are indications in the budget which favors the private sector investment, as Anushka said. And of course we don't deny that, we acknowledge that there are positive things, many positive things in the budget. But the problem is our domestic private sector, which is very tiny, very small, and we are talking about now the SME sector, because the kind of the private sector, modern private sector is very small. So that a small private sector, can they raise their investment from the current 22% of GDP to 35% or 40% level? And if it is the case, actually the problem is there, I don't think there is a shortage of investment or shortage of investors in the world. And why we don't get those investments to this country? If we target at least 1% of the foreign direct investment outflows in the world, that will account for about $15 billion a year. But we are struggling to get even 1 billion.
Professor Sirimal Aberatna, you said there is no economic vision. The Prime Minister made a speech in Parliament outlining the vision of the government. So you mean to say the Prime Minister did not have a vision, he was just making an announcement to please
No, I mentioned that there are indications in the budget, indications in the policy statement. There are certain key issues mentioned in the policy statement as well. That's very well, we acknowledge that these things are there. But the problem is now, how do we translate this entire thing into the action plan?
Thank you very much, Professor. I now move on to Anushka Vijayasinghe, Chief Economist of the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce. Anushka, do we have the right strategy in place in terms of budget 2016? We saw the Prime Minister making the economic vision, saying that more needs to be done, as far as said, tighten your belts, so on and so forth. Do we have the right strategy in place to move forward, to take Sri Lanka to the next level?
So, Shavin, I think the good news is that we saw a fair amount of consistency between the Prime Minister's policy statement and this budget. It would have been a lot more worrying if those two were divergent. So I think the fact that that's there and some of the things that were mentioned in the policy statement were sort of given effect, or indications of it being given effect through the budget. But I think historically in Sri Lanka, whether it's through budgets or things that are done in between budget speech cycles, is the implementation gap. And ad hoc changes in policy that don't come through budgets. I mean, this is what has historically also held our private sector back and foreign investors back. Professor Aberatna was absolutely right. We need foreign direct investment to come in. And when we speak to investors, what we hear is, you know, okay, your tax rates are fairly competitive. We are not too worried about tax incentives. What we need is consistency, and what we need is to make sure that what is said in the budget is then followed through with. What is said in the budget isn't changed halfway through because of political expediency or because the treasury is cash strapped or anything like that. So I think that is has to be a big part of the strategy. But broader picture, I think if a strategy is of overall private sector orientation, is of overall rationalizing government spending, making sure that the government has high impact where it's needed the most. For instance, like the proposal to spend more on education, to spend more on building science labs in schools, that's good. But controlling certain prices, that's not so good. So
I want to interrupt you for a second here now. I recollect a few months ago when the Prime Minister undertook a visit to Japan, the Finance Minister urged individuals, urged vehicle exporters, Sri Lankan vehicle exporters, not to send vehicles to Sri Lanka, and urged individuals in Sri Lanka not to purchase vehicles from Japan. However, now we hear that vehicle permits have been cancelled as well. Is this the way forward? Aren't they putting the people in trouble?
So I haven't looked at that specific proposal on the vehicles, but I think that you can get so much control as you'd like, or you attempt to control these different aspects of imports. But I think the focus needs to be not the short-term saving our foreign exchange
Finance
reserves.
Minister was not aware of the budget, I believe, at that time.
Probably not.
Thank you very much.
Just to complete, yes. I think the focus needs to be on the exports. Where is the dollars going to come from to pay for whether it's the cars or the fridges or the TVs? I think shifting from trying to curb imports to trying to boost exports needs to be where we have to focus.
Thank you very much, Anushka, for that. I now move on to Mr. W. Vijayawardena, former Deputy Governor of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka. Mr. Vijayawardena, on Wednesday, we see the government imposing a maximum retail price for big onions and potatoes. Number stands at 155 and 145 respectively. And today, we hear that the import taxes have been reduced on dal, potatoes and even big onions. What's happening, Mr. Vijayawardena? Who are they trying to fool?
Of course, that's why I think Prime Minister made a statement, economic policy statement in Parliament, outlining the vision of the government and the strategy which the Prime Minister and the government would be following in the next 5-year period to create wealth in the country. The whole entire government machinery will have to be aligned to the Prime Minister's statement today. So what has happened there is that one ministry has gone out of focus. Another ministry has tried to provide certain relief to the members of the public. And as a result, there has been this inconsistency in the pricing policy of the government. But when it comes to this maximum retail price, normally maximum retail prices are fixed by producers, not by governments. The producers fix them at a maximum level in order to prevent the retailers to sell beyond that, so that their competitors cannot take undue advantage of the producers.
Understood, Mr.
So it's not the government that has to do that. For example, some of the maximum prices that have been fixed above the prevailing open market price. So what it means is that it has given incentives for producers to increase the price rather than reduce the prices. So the objective of fixing the maximum retail price to relieve the consumers has been defeated. But at the same time, now we have to look at the current budget, and the budget has to align itself with the Prime Minister's economic policy statement. Even though Anushka says that it basically serves that purpose, I don't see that. I would have expected the Minister of Finance, instead of spending time on giving a history of economic policy in the country, if the first 45 minutes were spent on how the budget is aligned to the government's Prime Minister's economic policy statement, then of course we are consolidating all the government efforts within one single budget.
Thank you very much.
That is missing.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vijayawardena. I'm going to give 25 seconds to Anushka to respond to the allegation that was leveled against you by Mr. Vijayawardena, saying that he's not in agreement with what you said. 25 seconds to respond, if you want to.
I think we have to be realistic on the politics here. as an economist, I would dream of a budget that aligns itself perfectly to a Prime Minister's policy vision and is set, you know, absolute guarantee of no policy shifts for the next 5 years, economic fantasy land, honestly, as an economist. But we need to be realistic. I think this government is also, you know, very conscious of things that happened when it was last in power that made it unpopular. So really it's political economy, and they are going to do what is in their interest also, in a sense. I'm not saying that's a good thing either for the private sector or for the economy as a whole, but that's just the reality.
Thank you very much, Anushka. Mr. Vijayawardena, again, I'll give you 20
Well, of
seconds.
course, if you look at the political economy, there's a grave need for Sri Lanka's politicians to tell the nation. If we hide the facts from the nation, we are in bigger trouble. So that is what is actually happening. We are trying to hide the facts and then try to give palliatives to the members of the public, and what we are doing, we are postponing the problem, and as a result the problem is coming to us in a bigger way.
Thank you very much.
That is what we are actually doing today.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vijayawardena. I now move on to Mr. Lakshman Sirivardhana, Executive Director of the Pathfinder Foundation. Mr. Sirivardhana, prices of domestic gas cylinder reduced by 150 rupees. You have kerosene oil being reduced by a further 10 rupees. The government initially said that they will have a fuel formula in place, but no mention of anything of that sort now.
To begin with, that statement itself is something that cannot be condoned by any sensible person, leaving aside economists. Government is always trying to control prices, always trying to determine what something should be sold. Now, it was a very interesting thing. Can you imagine, somebody might say this is a stupidity, political even, controlling of prices of hoppers, milk tea, plain tea. This is kind of attempts that were made by the same government.
For around a week or so. Which was only effective for around a week or so. I went to a shop and it sold it for 25
In our area, it was. I mean, how can you do that? There should be. And this budget also, onions, 10 items are fixed, and this much is the prices. Do you know what? It's not happening now. Therefore, I think those who try to deceive people by showing that we are reducing prices will learn a lesson after some time. Initially, there will be people who are trying to justify it through political economy, like, you know, but in the reality, it affects your purchasing power, the individuals, and they realize that price controls doesn't work, then it will boomerang. And I think basically what we are in here is another period of zigzagging. Whatever that is mentioned in the so-called statement and the budget, you will notice in the days to come how many are going to be getting to the streets, because I told you, this is a coalition government, sort of a very weird animal. You can't have a uniform set of policies and implementation. You wait and see, you will be reporting these things very soon.
Thank you very much.
I'm not.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sirivardhana. I don't know whether you're being very optimistic or pessimistic about the budget, but I let the people decide for themselves what you're trying to say. We open the floor for questions from the journalists. Nadim, I want to ask the first question now from Anushka. Anushka,
you're asking too many questions.
one question from Anushka, and then I open the floor for you all to pose your questions. We have 15 minutes on the clock. Anushka, you said that the Prime Minister's speech a few weeks ago, enlightening about the country's economic vision, and the speech made by the Finance Minister is quite aligned. But I want to take your attention a little bit further back. The Finance Minister saying the economic deficit would be 6.8%. And then you have the Prime Minister saying a few weeks after, it's going to be 3.8%. And now, there is no budget deficit whatsoever. What are your thoughts on this now?
I think that's you're absolutely right. It's problematic, and we see this even in some of the growth forecasts for this year. We saw mixed messages coming from the finance ministry at two different points in time. We saw mixed messages coming from the finance ministry and the central bank. We then saw mixed messages on the growth number coming from within two individuals in the central bank. So you're absolutely right, it's problematic. And I just want to extend it a little further. I know you asked me on the deficit, I won't skip that, but this mixed messaging, particularly on the growth, is because I don't really know whether a lot of people, whether it's in the private sector or the public sector, know where growth is going to come from. Because for the first 5 years of post-war Sri Lanka, growth came from just 50 to 60% of growth came from just 4 sectors. All 4 of those sectors were what we call non-tradables, domestic economy sectors. And for a small economy, you can't grow at a rapid economic growth rate with just depending on the domestic sectors. And at some point, as we saw this year, that came to a head. And that no longer...
Harsh, you speak absolutely like an economist. Again, let's talk about the budget deficit. You are moving away from a core area now.
And the reason... okay. My point there was on the mixed numbers, because we are uncertain where the economy is going, because things that worked in the past may not work. And like has been said here, what's the vision? And that extends to the budget deficit as well. Again, what are the areas where revenue is going to come from? Are those areas that are going to grow in the future? Are we taxing, or are we giving more tax incentives to the areas that's going to bring the revenue? So I think there's a lot of confusion, but you said that there is no budget deficit that's listed this year. There is one, but it seems to be lower. And again, I say the curiosity here is that we are, or at least the budget is pinning more hopes on non-tax revenue, meeting that.
What's the number, Anushka? You said it has been indicated?
Yeah, the number is that it's going up from 126 billion to 378 billion. And that's a 200% increase. So that's interesting. And how much of hopes are being pinned on that in contributing to this now lower budget deficit is really interesting, and we need to see where it's going to go.
Thank you very much, Anushka. Nadir, so is yours?
Thank you, gentlemen. I want all of your input on this question, but seeing that Mr. Siriwardhan is a political science specialist, I'll pose this question to him initially. The 19th Amendment, we saw in the 19th Amendment what was introduced initially and what was eventually adopted was very, very different. This was because of what you say, the coalition government being a weird kind of animal. You know, it's the choir is not singing from the same hymn sheet. Given what we saw with the 19th Amendment and with other pieces of legislation as well in Parliament, including the attempt by certain government ministers together with opposition MPs to scupper the Treasury Bill limit increment, we saw the Finance Minister present his budget to Parliament. How likely is it that this could be very, very different when it is eventually adopted?
No, budget, there may be few zigzagging. There might be a possibility of, depending on the pressures from within the coalition, because you can't say that because it's a UNP itself doesn't have a clear majority. I don't know. Probably Finance Minister belongs to still the UNP. But then, what about the other? There might be pressures, there might be issues. My gut feeling is that even if budget goes through, there will be
pressures with implementation.
Pressures within the outside, within as well as outside with regard to the implementation. This is what is the problem. And at the same time, if the government consider going to fund and the IMF and the World Bank, they will have to have some of these reforms done. And whether that is understood by the other important segment of the government is another thing. Therefore, yeah.
You make reference to, Mr. Siriwardhan, you make reference to IMF and the World Bank for the second time now. I want to know, is this budget a UNP-led government's budget, or is the IMF or the World Bank budget? Why are you making reference so much to the IMF and the World Bank?
I didn't say that. I'm saying that these are options available to the government, and if you are going for those options, you have to have reform. But the reforms are not because the IMF and World Bank wants. Reform are necessary if the country is to progress further. But whatever that I said, please try to see that in the future, whether what I have mentioned here, the words that I have thrown.
You speak of reforms, Mr. Vardhana.
Huh?
You speak of reforms.
Yeah.
Tell me where we need to change.
Fundamentally, privatization of the state-owned enterprises is a must. Reduction of regulations that constrains private sector investment, private sector businesses, price controls kind of attitudes and things, whether it comes from the Prime Minister or Finance Minister, should not be there in the country. Because these are, and I have a feeling that, this is my sense, is that monetization of the fertilizer subsidy is something towards direction of removal of the subsidy or removal of the real value of the subsidy. Same with the school uniforms. You know, when you do that with the devaluation, with various kind of price changes, gradually what you get as today, say 10,000, will come to 5,000 effectively.
Professor Aberatna, Mr. Sirvardhan is of the view that privatization is a way forward. However, when I spoke to you a few years ago, you said privatization is not the way forward. You said privatization should come in a different way, and privatization in Sri Lanka is a taboo word. Do you agree or disagree?
I have never said anywhere that privatization is not an option, because I think that one of the major factors that determine the country's international competitiveness is the unfortunate situation of these state-owned enterprises. So there should be a reform process. Whether it is privatization or something else, they have to be on equal footing like the private sector.
Reform process, however, reference was only made to the BOI. Is it an underutilized institution?
I have no idea about the inside of the BOI, but of course I think the overall investment environment, the business environment, has very little to do with the performance of the BOI. So
you said privatization is important. I want to know what sort of institutions need to be privatized in Sri Lanka.
Oh, there are about 300 public sector institutions. Most of them are actually coming from our restrictive or import substitution regimes that lasted about 40 years ago. And I think the major ones are actually the loss-making major ones, and certain years in the past, and they have the losses of them were actually bigger than the entire welfare expenditure of the government.
Faraz?
How achievable are these reforms, like selling off the, in effect, the family silver, when we have the SLFP government who are committed to not selling the family silver, and we have Ranil Wickremesinghe and his party who are entirely capitalistic and who want to sell these things? So
that is actually the inconsistency of this policy framework, which destroys the private sector energy of this economy. And partly the problem is actually the political system, as it was discussed here, the democratic system. And in democracy we assume that the majority takes the decisions as they want.
Mr. Wickremesinghe is in the minority.
Yeah, but the problem is actually if they are political objectives, they are guided by their political objectives, of course you have to have some kind of a lukewarm policy that we have adopted in the past. But I think right now the situation is quite different. We have only choices between prosper or perish, because we have very little space for lukewarm policies that you have to mix economics with politics. That's the kind of crisis situation that Sri Lanka, the economy is right now. So that actually if you make the right choice, there is enough opportunity to make the country prosperous. And if you don't do that, And we have seen the inconsistency problem here, all the discussions that we have been carrying out here. And then that inconsistency is one of the major problems of our policy environment.
But just talking a little bit more about achievable reform, how about a need to encourage small businesses to have less of these compliance issues? You're supposed to be encouraging them, but this government is now going to have another authority to the small businesses to answer to. So they've got EPF, ETF, VAT, all sorts of compliance issues.
Yes.
These guys can't get on with their business. They're going to have to sit down and do all the paperwork.
That's right. And we have seen our history is the class to learn the lessons. Actually, in the history we have seen all this kind of institutional creation, but actually they very little have prospered after that. And I think the SME sector, the major problem is the regulatory system, and of course the big businesses have an advantage over the SME sector because they can cope with, they can deal with these regulatory issues, and because they have the capacity and ability to do that. But the SME sector, because they are small and their financial status are very weak, so that they cannot deal with these things. So actually when we have a regulatory system, when we have this kind of business environment which is actually not business friendly, and the SME sector suffers much more than the large enterprises. So that actually the policy reforms, the kind of policy reforms that we are talking about, that Mr. Sirivardhana mentioned here, the market-oriented policy reforms, they favor SME sector much more than the large businesses.
Anushka,
sorry,
give me a second. Let's listen to what Anushka has to say on that, and then you'll get the chance again to pose the question.
Very quickly, I think there may be a misunderstanding on this new SME. Maybe it was the wording in the speech, but from what I gather, it's not another institution to burden the SME sector in terms of new regulation.
They have to pay a fee. They have to report to them.
There's a huge need to formalize Sri Lankan SME. There's a huge amount of informality. So on one hand, so what I agree with is that there needs to be more formality. We've done work that has looked at the impact of this informality on the businesses themselves in accessing finance, in accessing new technologies, in accessing market information and so on. So that's the good thing. But I absolutely agree that the focus needs to quickly shift on deregulation, because even when you look at all these international benchmarks like the World Bank's Doing Business Index, it doesn't even capture small businesses around Sri Lanka. It usually captures the largest commercial city. So even when we look at those and see our ranking go up and down, it still doesn't capture how these regulations impact the SME sector. But more broadly, I think what needs to happen, and it goes back to your question on the vision, one of the key things that needs to happen is going line by line on some of these pieces of regulation which haven't been looked at for years. Are they still relevant now? Are they hurting small businesses? Is this unnecessary compliance? And I think if you do that, that can be much more transformational than any loan scheme or any tax cut.
Isn't it better to have a close look at the penal interest rates that are charged in the microfinance sector? And in his first budget speech, Mr. Karunaka said that he's going to have a cap of cap it at 40%. That was, at the rate then, was 56%. And he's now capped it at 40, but 40% compared to a mainstream loan of around 10 or 11%.
It's microfinance. It's around the world, it's like that. And I think what will be good to see is that there's a new microfinance policy coming in, and maybe some of those will get addressed. But I think we need to pin our hopes more on these SMEs trying to graduate and moving out of microfinance into traditional banking. And I don't know whether I agree with these caps imposed by the government and so on. But I think we need to be realistic that microfinance is for somewhat subprime lenders at a high interest rate. But I think we need to help SMEs go more towards the mainstream banks.
Thank you, Anushka. Mr. Vijayawardena, we're told that all state institutions are to be digitalized. Now, this is a costly affair. Already our public sector is top-heavy, as it were. And the public sector is mainly known for its lack of efficiency, delays, etc. and there's a massive salary bill going to the public sector. Ideally, shouldn't the government be focusing on this issue rather than opening another can of worms, the can of worms being introducing technology or digitalizing a sector that needs sort of reform in its own right?
Well, of course, the digitalization of the public sector is for the benefit of the members of the public. Because we have already seen in the case of the motor traffic department and also in the immigration department how the digitalization has helped the members of the public.
Right.
There is one unique example which I can quote about the Dompe Hospital, Dompe Base Hospital, of which the patient management system has been fully digitalized by the Dompe Hospital people.
Right.
When a patient comes there, from that point to the point where he is discharged from the hospital, the entire record base has been digitalized, and the doctors also prescribe medicine on the basis of that. And as a result, the members of the public get the benefit. So what I mean is, it's not a burden that has been imposed on the public sector, rather it's a measure to relieve the burden on the public sector. Because right now when the government authorities are doing it manually, there is no way for them to have the records, and when it is done manually it takes time, and also the members of the public will have to come to the particular institution to get the services. But of course, when it is digitalized from your home with a tablet, you can get the
your
entire
opinion is that it's a positive move.
It's positive and it's a must. It's a must.
Mr. Wijewardena, before we're out of time, so before we wrap up the show, there's a quick question that I want to ask you. It's about what the Finance Minister said about establishing a Exim Bank, the Export-Import Bank. I think he was talking about seed capital of about 25 billion rupees or more. What I want to ask is this: is there a need for such a bank? Is its task or function something that cannot be done by existing public banks?
Of course, an Exim Bank is necessary if a country has moved into the exportation of heavy capital equipment. Right now, our export structure is we are just exporting goods like garments, which does not need that kind of a long-term financing facilities. The particular export Exim Bank, the function of the Exim Bank is presently being done by other commercial banks, and we created the National Development Bank specifically for that purpose, to provide funding for the medium-term type of product exportation. Over the years, the National Development Bank has changed its focus and it has now become a commercial bank. But of course, commercial banks are in a position to do this job.
So is there a need for this Exim?
In my personal view, I don't think we have a necessity for establishing an export-import bank, because we don't export that kind of products.
And Mr. Wijewardena, in case this bank is set up, under which ministry do you think it will be listed? Under public enterprise or finance?
It will be Ministry of Finance.
It will be the only bank under him then?
Yeah, it will be Ministry of Finance. And then, of course, I mean, in the past, we had very bad example. We had the National Enterprise Bank under the Ministry of Industries. It became bankrupt. Then we started another bank called Lanka Putra Bank. It has now become bankrupt, and that is going to be absorbed by the regional development banks in terms of the new budget proposal. So these kind of banks are actually pet subjects being offered by various politicians because they want to have a bank for themselves.
And
now,
that's why the Minister of Finance
pretty soon I am not surprised if the Colombo municipality come up with the Colombo Metropolitan Bank.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for us for the final question. And
Megapolis project, you can have a bank.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. We move on to the final round. Before that, we're going for a short commercial break. This is Face the Nation. Our topic of discussion is Budget 26. Welcome back. This is Face the Nation. Final round. I now move on to Professor Sirimal Abeyratne, who is an economist. Professor Abeyratne, you have approximately 1 minute and 20 seconds. Inconsistency of a policy framework. Why must the people face the brunt? Because of the negligence of the parliamentarians or even the governments in play. The time starts now.
Yeah, because the investment, if you're looking at the investment climate, the business environment. And the investors actually, they are looking for the policy consistency. So if the policies are going to change and you adopt this, on the one hand the market oriented policies, and you propose those things in your policy statement and in your budget, but outside those areas then you bring out all anti-market oriented policies, and then there's no consistency, and then the predictability. So and also the long-term predictability of the policy environment. So these things are actually underlying very important factors that determine the level of investment of a country, and that's why that's one of the reasons, I guess, that we have missed the investment opportunities for Sri Lanka. So our policy environment has to be long-term, based on a long-term vision, as it was mentioned in the policy statement, and then all the other things, the short-term policy changes like the budget and all other overnight changes, and all these things should be consistent with that long-term policy statement. That's how we have to avoid the inconsistency, and that is very important to generate, to raise investment levels of the country.
Thank you very much, Professor Aberatna. I now move on to Mr. Anushka Vijay-Singha, Chief Economist of the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce. Anushka, you said that the budget hits the right notes in terms of the private sector. However, we saw a 5-day working week for the private sector employees being reduced, and another call by the government to increase the private sector employee wages to 2,500 rupees. Does it really hit the right notes?
On the first, it's actually after a consultation with the private sector, including a private sector group that deals with labor issues called the Employees Federation, that this proposal came, and there were negotiations between both labor and employers. So I think this wasn't a surprise to the private sector, because in fact a lot of the discussions had been had, and some of it suggestions originated from the private sector. On the second, I think it's very problematic when a government tells the private sector to raise wages. And in fact, there were some indications that it could have even been legislated, because inviting or asking the private sector to do it hadn't worked. So I think on the second point, we need to watch very, very carefully, because you cannot have a time when your public sector has expanded by over 30% over the last few years. You're still having loss-making SOEs. You're still having profligate spending in certain areas, but at the same time you're asking the private sector to increase wages, and you're taxing them to support this spending. So the second is problematic. The first was actually after consultation with the private sector.
It does not hit the right notes then. It does not hit the right notes, the budget 2016.
At the start I said it does hit many of the right notes, but like I said, we'll never get a budget that is ideal. And that's a reality. I don't like it as an economist, but I think we need to be very realistic about what budgets are. And just to finish, budgets are something, but really not everything. Much of our private sector, very dynamic. They would look to see what comes out of these budgets, but they're still going to continue to be dynamic. And our private sector, we've seen even go overseas now, but what we need to worry is if regulations here get too tight, will more of them go overseas, or will they continue to do business here?
Thank you very much, Anushka. I now move on to Mr. Lakshman Sirivardhana. Ms. Lakshman Sirivardhana, what is the way forward?
With regard to this private sector salary wanting the government to impose a ceiling or a control or an increase, the only thing I can say that if these politicians, if these officials, if these trade union leaders, are they going to implement in their own house for their domestics, their drivers, their gardeners, when it comes to increasing the salaries? No. This is how the selfish politicians try to push somebody else's money to be spent on something that they have nothing. Now, your question.
Way forward. Do you think reforms? You said reforms are needed, but what sort of reforms are needed? You said privatization
way forward
is important.
Is to have, to begin with, you will have to have a strong government which does not try to rely on various kind of groups, pressure groups and forces. That is a must. Nowhere in the world, at least among the Asian countries or any country, a country has developed unless there are weak governments, weak leaders, relying on various segments within the parliament or whatever the place. You can't have several power centers. You cannot be bound down to various local and foreign countries, their needs, and way forward is to have a liberal, free, as much as possible, market framework for commercial enterprises. If you can't do that.
Mr. Sirivardhana, we'll have to leave you at that. Now I move on to Mr. W. Vijayawardena, former Deputy Governor of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka. Mr. Vijayawardena, exchange rates, does this really concern or bother you as a former Deputy Governor of the Central Bank?
Well, of course, the current crisis in exchange rate is not a new one. It started in year 2012, and when we had a huge deficit in the balance of payments, in the trade deficit, which could not be funded by the remittances that were coming to Sri Lanka. And as a result, the government had to borrow in order to fill the gap in the capital account, which added to the foreign debt. As a result, today the debt service payments on account of the repayment of principal and the payment of interest has amounted to, within the next 12-month period, to some 4.4 billion rupees. But we have only free reserves amounting to 5.5 billion rupees. So we don't have enough foreign exchange to meet the commitments on account of debt, foreign debt alone. On top of that, we have to have an import program, we have to have services to purchase and all kinds of things. And therefore, there's a severe balance of payments crisis which has hit the country, and that is why I agree with Mr. Sirivardhana that government of Sri Lanka should immediately go for a facility with the International Monetary Fund in order to support the balance of payments. Without that, I don't think anyone can save Sri Lanka rupee today.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vijayawardena. Thank you very much, Professor Abeyratna. Thank you very much, Mr. Sirivardhana, and also Mr. Anushka Vijayasinghe, Chief Economist of the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce, for joining us this evening. A fruitful discussion indeed. Thank you very much, Nadeem, Sonali, and also Faraz for joining us. A few key points that I will be taking home today. Mr. Vijayawardena said that the information is only privy to the Finance Minister and not even the parliamentarians. Anushka saying hits many of the right notes in terms of the private sector. Mr. Sirivardhana saying reforms are needed, and Professor Abeyratna saying inconsistency in terms of the policy framework and there is no vision. Closure, transparency is needed in the coming few weeks in terms of Budget 2016. Taking control of your money, taking control of public money isn't a sprint, it is a marathon. Let's wait and see how this government will complete the marathon in the coming few weeks and few months and the next few years. Thank you very much for joining us. This is Face the Nation. Next week, same time, same place. Let's meet up and discuss what is the way forward for Sri Lanka. Good night.